Master Sergeant Collins, over to you, ma'am.
Good morning. I am Master Sergeant Collins from the Air Force's Personnel Center's Directorate of Personnel Programs.
And I am Staff Sergeant Will from AFPC's Directorate of Personnel Support. We will serve as your briefers today. We will be covering a lot of information, so we ask that you hold all of your questions until the end of this briefing. Next slide. Today we will be covering the overall purpose of the Air Force Enlisted Retraining Program. We will discuss this year's non-commissioned officer retraining program in its 3 phases. We will cover your roles and responsibilities as the customer. We will then review how to interpret the online myPers Retraining Advisory to include the advisory notes, along with a demonstration of how to navigate through the Air Force Enlisted Classification Directory. Today's webcast will lastly cover frequently asked questions. Let's begin. Next slide. In accordance with Air Force Instruction 362626, the overall objective of the Air Force Retraining Program is a force management program used primarily to balance the enlisted career force across all Air Force specialty codes and ensure sustainability of career fields. It is an opportunity to retrain disqualified airmen to a productive status. And lastly, it is the opportunity to allow a limited number of airmen to pursue other career paths within the Air Force. Let's now discuss this year's non-commissioned officer retraining program objective. Next slide.
NCORP is designed to optimize the enlisted force structure to best meet current and future Air Force requirements. NCORP is intended for second term and career airmen only, but does not apply to airmen currently performing duties in 8X Special Duty Identifiers and/or 9X Reporting Identifiers. This program consists of 3 phases. Next slide. Phase 1 begins on or about 3 August 2020. Voluntary applications must be submitted via myPers no later than 4 September 2020. A master vulnerability listing will not be produced this year. If your AFSC is on the retraining advisory as an out objective, it is recommended that you use phase 1 and volunteer for an AFSC that has an in objective. The objective of phase 1 is to obtain volunteer applicants from identified overage AFSCs, column type objective out on the myPers Retraining Advisory to fill requirements in shortage AFSCs, column type objective in on the advisory. During phase 1, only airmen holding a full AFSC annotated with an out objective may apply for identified AFSCs annotated within quotas for which they qualify. During this phase, the only NCORP retraining applications that will be considered are from airmen holding a control AFSC with an out quota. Applications are processed on a first come, first considered basis during this phase. If sufficient applications from qualified airmen are not received and retraining objectives for the fiscal year are not met, phase 2 will be implemented. Next slide. If implemented, phase 2 will begin on or about 1 December 2020. Airmen in identified overage AFSCs that have not volunteered by 4 September 2020 may be selected for mandatory retraining and assigned a training class based on Air Force needs to balance the force. The Total Force Service Center Retraining Office will begin selecting the most qualified in accordance with AFI 362626 in order to meet air staff remaining out objectives. Individual preference is no longer a consideration, and Air Force needs take priority. During this phase, volunteer applications will not be accepted. A retraining application will be open for phase 2 select via myPers. Airmen identified for retraining out will receive a system-generated NCORP notification message via myPers on or about 20 November 2020. Phase 2 select roster will be produced and distributed to 4 support squadron commanders and base level assigned career assistance advisors. Identified airmen will not be authorized to initiate voluntary applications to make themselves ineligible for retraining. Next slide. Phase 3 will begin on or about 1 February 2021. All remaining in quotas will be open to eligible second-term career airmen that were not identified during Phase 2. If holding a control AFSC not annotated with an out objective, out quota, your retraining application must be submitted simultaneously with an exception to policy, endorsed by your unit commander, requesting release from your control AFSC. This exception to policy will be forwarded to your control AFSC CSM for final approval. Next slide.
The next few slides cover retraining rules of engagement. We ask that you pay close attention. Following these rules of engagement will greatly aid in the processing of your retraining application error-free. Step 1, are you eligible? Prior to submitting a retraining application, you must first determine if you are eligible to retrain at this point in your career. This is a list of factors that are automatic disqualifiers for retraining. Input of any of these disqualifying factors automatically render you ineligible to retrain. Please note, even if selected and approved to retrain, input of any of these disqualifying factors before your class start date will result in cancellation. We also use the criteria outlined in Table 4.1 in determining specific eligibility. Next slide. Step 2, review the online myPers Retraining Advisory and Advisory Note. The Retraining Advisory is the primary means to advertise retraining requirements by fiscal year. The advisory advertises 2 types of requirements: out quotas, AFSCs where the Air Force has determined an overage may exist, and in quotas, AFSCs where the Air Force has determined shortages may exist. Use these AFSCs and number of quotas to determine your preferences when applying for retraining. Next slide. Shown here is how the Retraining Advisory appears on myPers. Here you can see which AFSCs currently have out quotas. Those AFSCs identified as eligible for retraining out represent areas where the current inventory, based on skill and grade, is healthy enough to take some risk. For example, for this illustration only, if your current control AFSC is 4R011 and you are technical sergeant select or above, your career field manager is not approving those ranks to retrain out at this time. As there are no out objectives listed, compare this to the control AFSC 4E011. For this illustration only, you will see that the 4E career field manager is in need of staff sergeant select through master sergeant to volunteer to retrain out of his career field. Next slide. Retraining in quotas identify AFSCs where the Air Force has determined shortages may temporarily exist. Customers will use these AFSCs to determine their preferences when applying for retraining. Those AFSCs identified as eligible for retraining in currently have lower inventories where current risk can be reduced by adding additional airmen. Retraining in quotas apply to all ranks listed. For example, in this illustration, if you are an E6 or above and would like to retrain in to 1 Alpha 111, you must first wait until class seats are available. However, notice for AFSC 1 Charlie 311, there are 16 quotas for staff sergeants and 15 for technical sergeants. Should you meet minimum eligibility requirements for these AFSCs, you may apply for them. As a reminder, fiscal year 21 quotas are for class start dates beginning 1 October 2020 through 30 September 2021. Next slide. The Retraining Advisory notes are co-located with the Retraining Advisory and provide specific guidelines and special or unique requirements for each AFSC. Applicants must review the Retraining Advisory notes for both retraining in and out quotas prior to submitting an application. Applicants must check these notes closely to avoid delays in the application process. When you click on the note number, the definition will appear in the yellow box. For this example, the 1N311N Career Field Manager has requested Advisory Note 167, which reads, Retraining out restricted to 1 Alpha 8X1 and 1 and 3X1 Staff Sergeant only. Next slide.
Step 3. The last step and final step is to review the Air Force Enlisted Classification Directory, located also on myPers. Here you will review AFSC specialty descriptions. This will help you in making your final selection of which AFSC to retrain into. Simply type AFECD in the search area. You will then be directed to the Enlisted Classification Directory link. Next slide. The Enlisted Classification Directory is posted twice a year, October and April. Ensure you click on the most current directory link. Next slide. Once you have the directory open, clicking the bookmark option is the best way to navigate through. Next slide. If quotas exist to retrain into 1 Alpha 0 X1, here you will click on the 1A to review the entry requirements for this AFSC. Next slide. The ECD provides the specialty summary, duties and responsibilities, and the specialty qualifications expected of this AFSC. Next slide. In paragraph 3.5 of each AFSC, you'll find the mandatory entry requirements. In this example, for entry into 1 Alpha 0 X1 career field, you must be medically and physically qualified for in-flight refueling. You must have a normal depth perception, eligible for worldwide deployment, and cannot be taller than 77 inches or shorter than 64 inches. For this AFSC, you will need to obtain documentation from your local military treatment facility showing that you are medically and physically qualified to retrain into this AFSC. Next slide.
Now let's check the last of the 1 Alpha 011 mandatory requirements for AFSC entry, also located within the Enlisted Classification Directory inside Attachment 4. Attachment 4 lists all the minimum requirements for mechanical, administrative, general, or electronic aptitude scores, strength aptitude codes, and physical profile series factor. Next slide. In this illustration, here you see the minimum requirement for the general aptitude score is 55. Strength aptitude codes are reflected in column X and identify strength standards required for entry into each AFSC. Here the requirement is code K, defined as retrainee must lift a weight of 70 pounds. Your PULHES must be a minimum of 111121 and must be accurately reflected on your Air Force Form 422. Next slide. Now that you have determined your eligibility, confirmed that quotas exist, and verified that you meet the specialty qualifications for the AFSC you desire to retrain into, you may click the Apply for Retraining link. Next slide.
Allow us now to cover some frequently asked questions. Where can I find the NCO Retraining Program guidelines? When logged into myPers, simply type in NCORP inside the search bar. The updated PSDM and PSDG will be posted and can be accessed on the Retraining myPers homepage. Next slide. What is the NCORP initial eligibility criteria? Must be eligible for promotion and reenlistment on your second or subsequent enlistment, have a current or projected grade of Staff Sergeant through Master Sergeant. If already projected for promotion, airmen volunteer for AFSCs and current control AFSC with shortages in projected grades. Note, airmen will remain vulnerable for NCORP if projected grade has retraining out requirements in their control AFSC. Airmen in the grade of Staff Sergeant or have projected grade of Staff Sergeant must have less than 12 years of total active federal military service as of 30 September 2021. Tech Sergeants and Master Sergeants must have less than 16 years total active federal military service as of 30 September 2021. Must not be projected for retirement, separation, PCS, or 365-day deployment. Next slide. When am I required to obtain retainability for my approved retraining class seat? Once you receive notification of your class start date, within 30 days, you are required to obtain a minimum of 24 months retainability from class graduation date. Please note, some AFSC awarding courses require additional retainability and will be annotated as such on your retraining RIP and listed with your student reporting instructions. Next slide.
Where can I find my student instructions? All student instructions are located on the Education and Training Course Announcements webpage listed here. Your student reporting instructions are mandatory requirements that must be met prior to departing for class. Shown here is the Education and Training Course Announcements website. This site is maintained by Headquarters Air Education and Training Commander and is provided on your training RIP. Once CAC's logged in at this site, click the Search tab to type in your new Air Force Specialty Code at the 3 skill level. This site will then populate your full course description to include student reporting instructions, security clearance, and uniform requirements. Next slide. Again, your student reporting instructions are mandatory requirements that must be met prior to your departure for class. In this example, please note there is an active duty service commitment of 36 months for this particular course, and all students must have an interim or final FBI eligibility security clearance updated in the JPass system prior to departing for this training. Next slide. How often is the online myPers Retraining Advisory updated? Daily. As class seats are being filled, the advisory will reflect such changes. Be sure to always refresh your browser to view the most current version. And remember, only apply for AFSCs where quotas exist, meaning if there is a 0 annotated, there are no more class seats for that particular AFSC. Next slide. How do I track my retraining package in myPers? Once you request to retrain, a retraining technician will be assigned to your application. Please allow a minimum of 20 duty days for that technician to review your record to establish eligibility for your requested AFSCs. There is not a need to call the Total Force Service Center for status of your retraining application. Track your application log on to the myPers website under My Account. Here, you will see your request for retraining and the myPers reference number. At all times, you are able to communicate directly with your assigned retraining technician by utilizing this open ticket. Next slide.
That concludes today's retraining webcast. Thank you for logging in. Today, we provided you information and guidance on the overall purpose of the Air Force Enlisted Retraining Program. We discussed this year's non-commissioned officer retraining program and its 3 phases. We covered your roles and responsibilities as the customer. We reviewed how to interpret the online myPers Retraining Advisory to include the advisory notes, along with a demonstration on how to navigate through the Air Force Enlisted Classification Directory. We will now open up this forum for any additional questions you may have. Please type them in now. And I also want to note that we are aware of the retraining application issues, so we ask that you please be patient, and if need be, you can submit a SME escalation ticket on myPers.
Well, yeah, thank you, Master Sergeant Collins. All right, we're going to do the best we can to answer as many questions as we can today. So please type your questions in on Zoom. Please type your questions in the chat area on Facebook, and type your questions in the chat area on DCS. Thank you so much.
There's a question on DCS. When does the new retraining memo for 2 alphas come out? It is currently live on myPers, and the advisory is live as well.
All right, go ahead with the next question. Sergeant Collins, do you have anybody on Zoom answering questions?
I'm not logged into Zoom. Is any of my team logged into Zoom? I'm on DCS and Facebook, but Facebook is scrolling too fast for me to see the questions.
Okay.
There is a question on DCS. If the MDL is not being used, what criteria is being used to identify? There will be an MDL populated for phase 2, and the list will be out by 20 November 2020.
All right, let me read a question for you that's on Zoom. For a tech sergeant who is still a first-term airman, do they also fall into the career airman or only FTA?
They will be considered FTA until they reach re-enlist. However, they would have to have an exception to policy because they're probably not within their window.
All right, thank you. Okay, another question on Zoom. If a staff sergeant is projected for separation in January, will they show as ineligible? And I can read that again. If a staff sergeant is projected for separation in January, will they show as ineligible?
Ronnie, are you on here?
Oh, sorry, that's Sergeant Ronnie. if a staff sergeant and court is protected for separation in January, yes, they should be able to apply online.
Did you have any questions from Facebook that you could answer at this time?
I believe I've answered most of the questions on the Facebook chat. I'm going through some of the questions right now.
Yeah, if any of them apply to the wide audience and they're not just individual questions about individual applications, perhaps you can just read a couple of the questions out loud and provide the answers if they apply to everybody.
Hi, this is
Yes,
Sasha
sir.
Lamont from Retraining. I have a question here on Facebook. If there's no out objectives for phase 1, do I have to wait till phase 3 to apply? The answer is yes. No ETPs are authorized during phase 1. So any member that doesn't have an out objective on the Retraining Advisory will have to wait till phase 3.
I have another question on Facebook as well. Since my PCS date from Germany is April 2021, I'll have to extend by a month or two to be eligible to retrain. Is that correct? That is not correct. Your current DROS is currently April 2021. Anyone with a DROS of 1 October 2020 to 30 September of 2021 can apply for retraining into FY21.
There's a question on Facebook about curtailing your DROs earlier to meet class dates. If your DROs is not in fiscal year 21, your DROs will not be curtailed unless you are applying for a battlefield AFSC. You will attend the phase 2 assignment and selection, and then we will curtail DROs if selected for battlefield AFSC.
I have another question on Facebook. How does the selective re-enlistment bonus repayment work? As far as retraining goes, you are eligible to apply as long as you have completed 50% of your current enlistment. As far as if you get approved, there will be a memo that's processed internally with the AFDC re-enlistment team, and then we'll request second Air Force approval.
All right, any other questions or any closing comments, Sergeant Collins?
For those questions that we were not able to answer, we will consolidate all questions and we will have all answers posted on myPers within the next couple of days.
Okay, very good. And just a follow up to that, you should see for everybody on Facebook, Zoom, and DCS, the PowerPoint slides from today should be on the myPers site posted tomorrow. And like Master Sergeant Collins said, we'll follow up with posting all the Q&As in about a week on myPers website. Many thanks for joining us today. AFPC is signing out.